I'm so thrilled to see you all here around in my home. These are so strange times, and still there's some grace even in the most difficult times. And this is one of the graces to see you all here. Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you for having me, for spending your lunch hour listening to this. And what I am planning to talk about is technology, theology, and spirituality in the digital age. And in terms of setting the scene, I would like to say that we are seeing two tendencies for the last 3 decades or so, namely the spread of secularization on the one hand and the so-called return or the new visibility of religion or God on the other hand. And this may seem contradictory forces, but they tend to occur simultaneously. And this makes for a fascinating time with demanding challenges and exciting possibilities for religious leaders, as well as theologians and scientists who do not share the conflict view of religion and science. On the one hand, not least in the wake of the current pandemic, we are witnessing a new interest in existential and religious questions, though often in combination with much ignorance about religious traditions. On the other hand, we are witnessing new fierce attacks on religion. The baseline of the argument often being that religion is irrational and prone to violence, as terrorist attacks, as well as the oppression of women and the LGBTQI persons seem to suggest, and therefore ought to be combated or be deprived of any influence whatsoever on society. And increasingly so, during the last decade, these dynamics have intersected with major social and political challenges. In many countries of the world, people are drinking from a dangerous cocktail made up of poisonous ingredients, all starting with the letter P. Polarization, populism, protectionism, post-truth, and patriarchy. Obviously, patriarchy is not so much a sign of precisely our times as the others are, because it has been around for much of history. Nevertheless, it also develops a specific synergy with the other P's. And polarization, of course, tears apart societies, as well as smaller communities. And this happens in terms of increasing income gaps, as well as gaps in education and health. We see increasing polarization between political blocs, even in Europe, between generations, and between urban and rural areas. And this, of course, provides a very fertile ground for populism. Populism draws its energy from pitting people against each other. And of course, populists claim to be the voice of the people, which according to populist narratives is just one voice that speaks out against the elites. And they tend to put their own people above all other, thus promoting nationalism. And in the so-called Christian West of Europe, they urge the churches to become part of the nationalist, anti-Muslim, and beyond the surface, even anti-Semitic project. And if the churches resist, they are accused of no longer being Christian churches, but being political, leftist political. Protectionism is one of the consequences of populism. It puts one's own group, country, first at the expense of common interests. Protectionist campaigns are known to build on lies. You know a lot about this in the US, of course, which brings us to post-truth. The insight that democratic elections or referendums can be won even though the facts are wrong and key campaigners are lying is, of course, a shocking fact. And we should remain shocked and not get used to it. if democracy is the way of governance that we want to promote and to defend. According to moral standards, a person who is found to have lied should, of course, be ashamed, confess, and do better. If a person found out to have lied instead displays shamelessness, proceeds with even more lies, and wins, that shakes some of the foundations of democracy, because democracy can only work if there is some level of consensus on values, such as a reasonably honest culture of debate, equal participation, respect of human rights, and accountability not only to voters, but also to moral values. And finally, patriarchy is the disturbing background noise in history. Although progress in gender equality has been made, not least during the 20th century, we hear about backlashes in many places in these days. Societies and communities with gender equality do better than others, yet there is still old resistance and even new resistance. Of course, churches are known to not always have championed gender justice and not always champion it today either. On the basis of God creating the human person in God's image and in light of Apostle Paul's words in Galatians 3:28, objecting to gender justice is a deviation from Scripture. Therefore, churches need to see gender justice as part of their mission in today's world. It is a win-win concept, and there are ample data showing that gender justice is conducive to progress on many, if not all, of the sustainable development goals. And theologically speaking, I think we can say that counteracting gender justice in the name of freedom of religion or belief, as it happens today, even within the context of the United Nations, is a sin. So drinking from the poisonous cocktail of the 5 Ps brings out a behavior that manifests itself in being against refugees and migrants, against climate action, and against equality and gender justice. That is the unholy trinity, at least in my context. The 5P discourse also tends to promote very static ideals, orienting itself from the past, like make America or Europe great again, keep women in their traditional roles. And the difference here is, of course, that theology should not argue from static ideals of the past, but from dynamic promises oriented towards a future that is better understood as Adventus, Advent, rather than Futurum, where Advent is that which comes to us from the future, and Futurum is what you extrapolate from what you already know. So much for setting the scene. I want to continue with a challenge for science and religion dialogue. And here my point is that we need to rethink science and religion more deliberately from the perspective of spirituality. That way we can provide an alternative to rigid rationality on the one hand and boundless relativism on the other hand. By way of example, comparing Western and Eastern Orthodox tradition, you can say that Western Europe, at least in Western theology, have been deeply shaped by 2 intellectual movements that did not affect Eastern Orthodox theology in the same way, namely Renaissance humanism and the Enlightenment. And the ensuing reverence for reason, in the sense of ratio, led to the preference of rationality over, say, mystery, not only in secular knowledge, but also in theological discourse, where Occam's razor and reductionism became the hallmarks of rationality. Concepts such as mystery and divine energies become almost obsolete, or at least much less attractive. And consequently, in much of Western thought, we found ourselves thinking in terms of mystery versus rationality and not mystery and rationality. In the long run, however, any one-sided diet whatsoever is not healthy for an organism. A one-sided rational or secular diet makes for a rather pale organism, and people will start looking for colorful dietary supplements somewhere else. And I think we see that happen all the time. So we are engaged in religion and science dialogue, are and need to be interested in making things intellectually fit. We struggle to find a coherent and adequate language that reflects the progress of science, while at the same time allowing for the fruitful communication of a theologically sound worldview. We are willing to accept a certain level of tension between the two areas, but we are not willing to accept plain contradiction between them. So making things fit intellectually is important. Yet as necessary and desirable as it is not sufficient. People want and need to see things fit also spiritually. If we are serious about religion and science dialogue making a difference, this dialogue must become intellectually and spiritually fit in ways that surpass that we have for now. Almost certainly so in times of the current cluster of crises. Maybe the proneness to embrace conspiracy theories is enhanced by the lack of a religion and science discourse that is not only intellectually sound, but even spiritually sound. It's not enhanced, but is counteracted by a good religion and science discourse. What transcends rationality is not automatically irrational. Rationality is no longer as clear-cut in either or terms as the modern mind liked to believe. There is more both and thinking, and more of an understanding that both and is not necessarily the same as compromised truth claims, and that both and is not a license for undisciplined or sloppy thinking. So I want to suggest that a widened understanding of the intellectual endeavor to include spiritual dimensions is critical, especially in a digital age. It is only the togetherness of brain and heart, as it were, that makes for an adequate understanding of a person as well as for smart organizations. So the digital age. It goes without saying that Christianity is basically a science affirming and technology friendly religion, because whatever helps people to thrive, whatever alleviates suffering, whatever is good for the most vulnerable is a sign of the realm of God. If engineering serves these purposes, it makes for both meaningful and responsible change. And both these words, meaningful and responsible, reflect deeply humanistic values. You are always responsible in response to another. You respond to the words, the glance, the gestures, the emotions, the needs or demands of the other. And it is the simple observation that reveals something of the very dynamics of human existence. Life is relationality. As persons, we relate to the rest of nature, as actors, as well as dependents, dependent on the rest of nature or creation for each and every breath we take. For our survival, we also need a second relation, namely the relationship to our neighbor, our fellow human beings, realizing that we ought to build a world of neighbors. Since, as the pandemic teaches us, we are one humanity under one sky. And moreover, we need to relate to ourselves in healthy ways, of course. And on top of that, as humans, we have never stopped seeking a relationship with the transcendent, that which is beyond the tangible and knowable, beyond the calculable and scalable. We call it sacred, holy, God, the very deep experience of our need to focus on and beyond the horizon in order to understand and make meaning of what for us lies in front of the horizon. So in short, human life, it's my point of departure, human life is marked by relationships, relation to nature, each other, self, and the transcendent, which makes a fourfold web of relationality. Fourfold web of relationality. So how then does this fourfold web of relationality thrive in the time of the World Wide Web? How will it thrive in the age of AI? I guess we are all excited about the enormous possibilities AI opens up, but we also need to ask critical and self-critical questions. And sometimes coming up with the right questions is the most important work. So what does AI do to our human self-understanding? Who is benefiting in the short run and in the long run? Who is paying the price in the short term and the long term? How will AI be good for the little ones, those who Jesus used to move to center stage, knowing that what is good for the little ones is often good for the big ones as well? Ethics needs to be part of the discussion right from the beginning. It is not good enough to just follow the trail and call upon the ethicist only to fix the problems we inevitably will run into. If we want to build good societies, democratic societies that are good for their citizens, ethics must be part of the whole journey. Ethics is a starting point and needs to be considered throughout the whole process and life cycle of an AI algorithm. At least in Sweden, that is not self-evident that it should be like this. And I think that theologians could be of help here. Via our methods, we are trained to connect the dots in relating to complex issues and ethical reasoning over the long haul. In times of rapid and profound change, we must be particularly mindful of our history, because people who lose or are deprived of their history also lose out on their future. Periods of great transition require spiritual resilience from individuals as well as collectively from societies. And we know that we are up for substantial changes. As the chair of one of the real big Swedish businesses puts it, we have in our company a 10-50 rule, which means in 10 years, 50% of the things we are doing now, we will no longer be doing. So this is indeed time for joint transdisciplinary reflection on how AI develops and will affect people's lives, societies, and the planet, and comprehensive education regarding these issues. Otherwise, we might very soon find democracy under even more serious attacks. So what should we be aware of in terms of critical and self-critical accompaniment of AI development? In general, I would say that digitalization and the development of AI force us to rethink common concepts such as trust, society, communication and manipulation, human relationships, work, death, personal integrity, and privacy. The shift in the labor market from more people means growth to more data means growth is momentous. In fact, we will ask anew, what then is a human being? And like Pontius Pilate, we will also need to ask, what then is truth? in terms of individual aspects, technological development is driven by the pursuit of perfection. Human creativity is driven by the experience of imperfection and finitude, combined with the imagination of a wholesome future. That makes for an interesting tension. But that would be a different lecture. Regarding today's new forms and new scope of connectedness, we must ask, has evolution really equipped us to examine what like thousands of people think of us, which we do when we count likes on Facebook and Twitter? How then do we hold on to what we would say is our authentic self? How big a gap is there between our authentic selves and our digitally brushed up self-representations? And if that brittle social media popularity breaks down, what is going to fill the void? Software engineer Justin Rosenstein, who helped create the Facebook button, the like button, said, "When we were making the like button, our entire motivation was, can we spread positivity and love in the world? The idea that teens would be getting depressed when they don't have enough likes, or it could be leading to political polarization, was nowhere on our radar." So that good intentions can lead to bad consequences is, of course, nothing new. That has been the case ever since the gates of paradise closed behind Adam and Eve. Yet in the digital world, the effects can keep spiraling forever without much of an opportunity to haul things back and make them better. We know today that social media technology impacts human interaction and self-esteem. It tends to reduce us to users and products. People are dehumanized and human dignity gets jeopardized. The technology that connects us also manipulates us, polarizes us, controls us, monetizes us, and distracts us. It leads us into self-exploitation, as German-Korean philosopher Byung-Chul Han has observed. And some of you may know that already in 2010, Nicholas Carr, author of the book The Shallows, and a number of subsequent books, stated, "Over the last few years, I have had an uncomfortable sense that someone or something has been tinkering with my brain, remapping the neural circuitry, reprogramming the memory. My mind isn't going, so far as I can tell, but it's changing. I am not thinking the way I used to think." Our human emotions and fears are monetized. People turned into products, or as Jaron Lanier puts it in the documentary, The Social Dilemma, it is the gradual, slight, imperceptible change in our own behavior and perception. That is the product. So that is individual aspects. What are the social aspects? Well, never before have a small bunch of designers, pretty young white guys, had the power to influence how billions of us think, act, and live our lives. Technology is changing what you do, how you think, who you are, and constantly tracking the slightest changes. Surveillance capitalism emerges as a new kind of marketplace. The merchandise are we. It is a trade in human futures, to use Shoshana Zuboff's expression. And our attention is the gold mine allowing our minds to be mined. So probably we can learn a lot from those early days industrialism, when it was bodies that were mined. Now it's minds that are mined. We are moving from a tool-based economy to a manipulation and addiction-based economy, which clearly affects, again, democracy. If the digital age were to be synonymous to disinformation, the age of disinformation, democracy would be bound for death. Some studies claim that since the introduction of the cell phone, the younger generation has become more anxious, fragile, and depressed. There are fears that we are losing a whole generation to anxiety, depression, self-harm, and even suicide. Have we all become dependent on a digital pacifier? If we are reduced to being users and products, merchandise, democracy is indeed under attack. Citizenship then needs to be rediscovered. Rather than consumption, citizenship is marked by participating and contributing. Its hallmark is dignity rather than value. Already in the design or concept stages of AI, the risk of bias is obvious. Self-driving cars and the moral machine experiment have demonstrated that ethics are different across cultures and groups of society. Who decides which ethics should be guiding the development? Again, it is key to work multidisciplinary and cross-sectoral, since AI developers do not represent a diversity of groups and people, nor are they ethicists. Another risk is that the technological development is so complex that few own it and understand it. And at some point, there may be no human at all who understands it. How then can we ensure that a particular AI is serving the greater good? How can end users have trust? Here, I think the joint work in the European Union for trustworthy AI based on fundamental values and freedoms and the cooperation across EU member states is relevant. It is meant to help the EU to develop its own approach to AI development and application relative to, for example, China, with the control of citizens, or the US, where the development is industry-led, aiming at a better society and better lives for all. The result remains to be seen, which brings us to political aspects. Recalling the 5 dangerous P's: polarization, populism, protectionism, post-truth, and patriarchy, we can see that each of the 5 P's reveals a surplus of fear and a deficit of hope. And that might be the diagnostics that is quite relevant here: a surplus of fear and a deficit of hope. And of course, that can develop quite a destructive synergy together with the advance of AI technology. Because AI adds some further spices to this toxic cocktail, from Cambridge Analytica and the attempts to manipulate elections to the role of Facebook in Myanmar and Google's way of handling the Chinese censorship. Responsibility and accountability are not really straightforward in these cases. Adaptation and legislation is required. Attention must be paid to both ethics and trust. Anti-democratic uses of algorithm challenge not only the scientific and technological literacy of the world's population, but also its social, moral, and spiritual literacy. In terms of global aspects, trust may well be the ultimate currency for the future. Trust as currency. The question of trust will be relevant to how successful we will be in putting AI in the service of handling, for instance, the climate crisis. We need AI to be human-centric, or else we will be facing a dystopic future. And I'm deliberately using the word human-centric rather than anthropocentric, because anthropocentrism has been the driving force in the exploitation of our natural environment and thus instrumental in bringing about a host of environmental crises and climate change. By human-centric, I mean centered in humanistic values about human dignity and rights, and resolved to bring this fourfold web of relationality into flourishing: relation to creation, fellow humans, your own self, and God. And for this to happen, we need a lot of soft skills, but also laws and regulations to ensure that all technical developments serve people and planet. Otherwise, we might see a concentration of intelligence in terms of fewer being really intelligent. And in the long run, this means more than losing a lot of jobs, as serious as that is, but also losing out on intelligence overall. So what does it take to be a good leader in this situation? And I would think being a leader is more than being a manager. To put it a bit simplified, being a manager is about a position. Being a leader is based on relationships. A leader must have a holistic view of people and things, be visionary, build trust, cultivate hope, and lead through times of uncertainty. And a good leader should honor and make use of the role of civil society. We need to navigate in a landscape where good leaders need to be equipped with 4 equal sets of skills: technical and economical know-how, political realism, social responsibility, and spirituality. And this requires more than excellent training. It requires comprehensive education. It requires Bildung. This also includes religious and spiritual literacy, since, as I said before, the beyond the horizon helps us to understand and to live the in front of the horizon. And coming to a theological conclusion in the end, what do we need in terms of theology? I would say that we need a theology of resilience, of coexistence, and of hope. A theology of resilience will enable us to make sense of the fights of women and men for the health, well-being, and future of their children. It will help us to, both in words and deeds, do what needs to be done in order to foster human rights, equality, peace, justice, and reconciliation. With a theology of resilience, we will be able to confront the trends and powers that hamper our constructive engagement with the greatest challenges of our time. So we'll be able to confront polarization, to resist populism, to counteract protectionism, to fight against post-truth, and to overcome patriarchy. And with a theology of coexistence, we will be able to revisit some of the borders that are harmful to our working and living together as one human family. We will be able to foster more adequate views of nature, and will listen to the groaning and longing of creation for the revealing of the children of God, Romans 8. And this will put us in a more effective position to address climate change in a holistic way. With the theology of coexistence, we will also be more eager to hear the stories of those who are suffering and will be suffering from the degradation of their environments and livelihoods. And we will be better at listening to the voices of indigenous peoples. And a theology of hope, finally. Well, it will give us reason to expect change. underlying all those major questions of our time, for believers and non-believers alike, there is a pressing question: what may we really hope for? And clearly, people of faith have a special vocation to respond in honest, empathetic, and intelligible ways. Thinking of 1 Peter 3:15, always be ready to make your defense to anyone who demands from you an accounting for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and reverence. So this might be the time to revisit some of the great theologians from the 1970s onward, such as Moltmann, Johann Baptist Metz, and Dorothee Sölle. Their emphasis on the nature and necessity of hope may prove relevant for us today as well. Let's remember that hope is different from optimism. Optimism is an extrapolation from what we already know, but hope is the power that can relate constructively to that which we do not know and maybe never can know, to the unknowable. Hope transcends the purely rational without being irrational. That's the clue. It transcends the purely rational without being irrational. It brings ratio, the calculating mind, and intellectus, the insightful mind, together in a way that renders an existential surplus without which we cannot navigate in the digital age. It seems to me that we need to find theologically sound ways of accounting for a hope that, that has at least three components, namely anger, humility, and courage. Because a hope that is trustworthy needs to be able to harbor anger and frustration and suffering about all that which is not right. It also needs the strong sense of humility, that is our sense of what is our vocation, what is our role in this life. That is a sense of humility. And it needs courage, because I think in most situations, at least in very many situations, we still have the choice of choosing the path of courage rather than the opposite. So I think this is one of the way forwards, a theology of resilience, a theology of coexistence, and a theology of hope. Thank you for listening.